Once again, we have that problem. The principle, to my thinking, is unexceptional. The principles of inadmissibility of acquiring territory by war, full withdrawal, mutual recognition. The problem is not the principles. The problem is in their application. The one side that has de facto accepted the principle is subjected to brutal economic sanctions. And the side which has rejected the principle goes its merry way. That, as I see it, is the basic record on the conflict. And now I have to look at, if it's true what I'm saying, where does the controversy come from? I want to look at two aspects, because time is short and I want to have a dialogue with you. First, to my thinking, there is one aspect of the Israel-Palestine conflict about which there is legitimate controversy. It's not fake, it's not contrived, it's legitimate. And that's the question of the Palestinian refugees. Let me just quickly go through a series of issues. Number one, you can factually agree that the Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed, but carry a different moral judgment on that ethnic cleansing. What does that mean? You take the case of this fellow Benny Morris, the story of the Palestinian refugees. He doesn't dispute the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. He just happens to think ethnic cleansings are sometimes good things. They're not always bad. So he says, take the case of North America. He says, I'm using his words, not my own, the annihilation of the Native Americans. He said that was a good thing because it made possible the great American Republic. And similarly, he says that the expulsion of the Palestinians was a good thing because it made possible a Jewish state. Or you take the case of Professor Dershowitz at Harvard, who says that ethnic cleansings are a fifth-rate human rights issue, analogous to massive urban renewal. Well, you can't really say those you can't really say those moral judgments are wrong in the sense that facts are wrong. You could say they are Nazi moral judgments, and I would agree with you, but you can't say they are wrong moral judgments. If you take Mr. Morris, Mr. Dershowitz, set them aside for the moment, and return to the moral universe of most normal human beings, you still have problems. Because you can agree in your factual judgments, your moral judgments, your legal judgments, but still disagree in your political judgments. What does that mean? Take the case of Professor Chomsky. He doesn't dispute that factually the Palestinians were expelled in 1948. The historical record documents that. He doesn't disagree that morally it's an abomination. Of course, ethnic cleansings are an abomination. And of course, he agrees Palestinians have the right of return. And that too, and I hope people will check the record, don't believe me, the omnibus dubitandum, doubt everything, check for yourself. There's no dispute at all on the Palestinian right of return. 2000, 2001, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they all published opinion papers on the right of return. And they all agree, under international law, the Palestinians and succeeding generations which have maintained genuine links with the land, that's the technical language, have the right of return. These are not controversial issues. However, it can be said that politically it may not be feasible. Politics means how much power you can summon up in order to impose your will. And Professor Chomsky says politically, I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it's going to happen. And he says, I think it's immoral to tell Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon that they're going to return when we know they're not. Now, my own view, for what it's worth, is that political judgments are just that. They're judgments. You have to weigh 1,000 different factors. And if you weigh the 1,000 different factors and conclude it's not going to happen, then there is an argument for saying it's immoral to raise people's hopes. On the other hand, you can weigh those 1,000 different factors and conclude it is feasible, in which case I think it's perfectly moral to advocate it. One question does arise. Some of you may be thinking, I'm a little confused here. What does it mean to say you have a right, but then say its implementation is not feasible? That sounds like a contradiction. It sounds like a word game. How many people are of that opinion? And it makes no sense to talk about you have a right, and then you say you can't implement it. Raise your hands. Good. And to be perfectly candid, for the longest time, I myself had trouble grasping that principle. I didn't quite know what it meant. And then last year, in my own way, I experienced that kind of dilemma. Now, I'm not speaking about comparative suffering. I'm simply talking about a principle. As many of you know, last year I was denied tenure by my university, and there were many people, including my lawyer, but many others, who were of the opinion that if I went to court, if I battled it out, that I would, in the end, win my right to return to the pool. But my lawyer said, no, that's going to be a 6-year or so battle, because that's how long tenure cases usually take. And then she said, you have to make a decision. Do you want to battle it out through eternity, or do you want to shoot for a settlement? Well, tenure was not my number one item on my agenda. There are bigger issues for me. And I said I'd rather go for the settlement. Now, when I said I was willing to settle, that does not mean that I didn't think I had a right to return. I did then, and I still do now. But I chose a settlement. Now, in my case, the settlement, in my opinion, is not very different than a possible settlement with the Palestinians on the question of the refugees. Number one, I demanded that the ball, which in my opinion had dirtied my name, they had to issue a public statement getting the historical record correct. And that meant, which they did in the end, issuing a statement saying that Finkelstein was an outstanding teacher and a prolific scholar. They had to acknowledge the record. And number two, there had to be a material component to the settlement. In my view, that's a possible way of resolving the settlement of the refugee issue. Number one, the Israeli government has to acknowledge the historical wrong that was done. The current position of the Israeli government is, quote, we accept no political, legal, moral, or historical responsibility for what happened to Palestinian refugees. In my opinion, that's a non-starter. If that's what the poll said to me, I wouldn't have accepted it. And number two, there has to be the financial component. I think it's a possible way to resolve the settlement issue. I don't impose it on the Palestinians. Nobody has the right to tell anyone what to do with their rights. It is their right. And it's our responsibility to support that right. But I don't consider it an insurmountable barrier to resolving the conflict. And there